Okay, welcome back everyone. Day 2 of week 7. We'll be going back to Michael Smith and Rahul Telang's streaming, sharing, and stealing. Specifically the chapter Revenge of the Nerds. So we're still talking about other platforms outside of Netflix. A lot of talk about Apple today. But also, this is the chapter that precedes the chapter that we already read, which was Moneyball. One quick note, something that I was actually going to bring up during the semester, but I think it's worth thinking about that for the first paper, nearly half of the class chose Moneyball, and that's just something I wanted to point out. Like, what does that mean? Why is it that nearly half of the class chose the same chapter? What is it about that chapter that compelled people? Or made it a front runner as far as the choices of what to write about. But I do think it does say something about both the book and of course both about us as well. So just to dive kind of right into it, let's start with the kind of key points just to sort of orient us again, and then we'll go from there. So for one, I just want you to think about, in relation to what Telang and Smith are talking about, just the litany of now defunct services, right? Specifically, defunct internet platforms, right? Internet streaming platforms, and just between the Tryon chapter and then this one, if we think about Ultraviolet, Amazon Unbox, NBC Direct, Press Play, MusicNet, etc. Just the fact that, and for example, we MySpace is now kind of a joke, right? Napster is another one that came up, LimeWire. And this has become kind of either joke fodder or kind of like the nostalgia meme fodder, right? Where it's like, if you remember this, ... or like, does anyone remember Tom from MySpace? But it's really important historically to kind of remember that the way things are right now, so this kind of, de facto sort of choice of whether it's Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat or Netflix, it's not necessarily this kind of process that's clean or quick. Right? This is a very complicated process. There are a lot of, let's say, kind of alternatives and different ways that things could have gone. So it's always kind of important to remember that. And also just again to think in those sort of historical terms, to consider the fact that, we've talked about this before, very early on. There was a point in which Blockbuster could have put Netflix out of business. Netflix being at the top of the mountain does not necessarily mean because they're so clearly and obviously the sort of best candidate, let's say, so to speak. That there are just a number of other factors, and so for every Netflix, there's a Ultraviolet that should be talked about, that should be remembered, right? Okay, 2. I guess that it just kind of feeds into 2, which is is that this is a sort of key moment. We're talking about a key moment in streaming history. And it's one that coincides really with piracy, right? So a lot of the chapter talks about a moment in 2007, and just to kind of build off of something that I said on Tuesday, but again, 2007 feels like ancient history to especially to you guys, right? We're 13 years away from that. This is even before the housing collapse, right? But for one, it's true, right? Like, academia is a very slow-moving glacier, so it takes time. Sometimes not for the best reasons for work to get out, but there's also a legitimate reason for why work moves so slowly, is because it takes time to, if you want to be thorough, if you want to be careful, if you want to be precise, and you want to be exhaustive, and you want, to produce like real evidence, then the research takes time. Thinking about this stuff takes time. We can't all just fire off whatever we want, whatever we're thinking about on the internet. And so, people are scrambling, for example, to write about the coronavirus right now, like scholars are, and that's going to take time to kind of really, here comes moment number one where I really want to scratch my nose, to appreciate like what's going on and understand what's going on and evaluate and analyze. So it takes time, but just again, like, be careful of the assumption that just because this was written, a few years ago, or written about stuff that happened 13 years ago, does not mean that there's no kind of relevance for our moment now. In fact, like, I'm just gonna say it. It's kind of a lazy way of thinking. We're in a moment that's so specific and unique and particular that nothing else that's happened before has no bearing on it, and that something written, God forbid, 5 years ago just can't tell us anything about our current moment. No, I think that's more of a mechanism, like, I don't want to try and figure out how this is relevant, because most of the writers, perhaps even all of the writers, are writing about past phenomena precisely because it helps us understand what's going on now. And I would suggest that like, that's the value of thinking about this specific moment in streaming history, because it really gives us a sense of why things came to look the way that they do, right? So Smith and Telang are basically kind of making a claim that something shifts after this moment, especially with the kind of cross-section between streaming and piracy, right? And this is another instance, right, of what we've already talked about so far, of this idea of like the negotiation, right? So, like, history is our processes of negotiation and contention and conflict. And so this is another moment between, like, consumers and, again, producers, amongst distributors, Apple, NBC Universal, but also, consumers who are pirating, and trying to figure that out and sort of, find some sort of balance or equilibrium, right? And then finally, our favorite, the idea of hegemony. And just as another refresher, coming back off of break, a much more kind of, how do I put it, nuanced way of understanding sort of domination that's less kind of forceful or coercive, but again, kind of coming from Antonio Gramsci, the idea of cultural hegemony by consent. So how do we have, someone, how does power kind of get consolidated or aggregated, and how do people kind of also play a part in that? So how do these things kind of happen? So it's like, how does power get gained without it necessarily being taken, right? If that makes sense. So part of this is talking about the sort of power shift. I mean, a lot of the semester has been thinking about power shifts in the media industry and like what streaming has done to that, right? And so especially we're going to be talking about, and Telang and Smith talk at length about the shift of power from like the television networks and the media conglomerates like NBC Universal and over towards Apple. And I think that's kind of where we can get, because they're a little esoteric about their chapter titles. So this one is Revenge of the Nerds. Let me look really quick. I don't know if... Yeah, like all of their titles are titles of media. Their first chapter, which we also read, was House of Cards, right? So Revenge of the Nerds here is the idea of like Silicon Valley, right? And the IT giants finding themselves having much more power in media because of streaming. So that's the introduction. We'll stop here and then we'll get to it.